Session 6 of our class on Biblical Worldview 1. We are in the second week and in chapter 3, or chapter 2, I'm sorry, of Living God's Word. And where we left off in chapter 1 was that God had created the world in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. He made it perfect and had direct fellowship with mankind, Adam and Eve specifically. And then in Genesis chapter 3, Adam and Eve sinned and they were cast out of the garden. And then in Genesis 4, Cain killed his brother Abel. And then in Genesis 6, we read that mankind, his thoughts were only evil continually. And therefore, chapter 6 through 9 concerns the worldwide flood. And then in chapter 11 of Genesis, we read of and studied the idea of the Tower of Babel and how God confused the language, or the languages of the people, the language of the people, and caused different groups to speak different languages. Now, so with that overview of what we've seen, as is pointed out at the beginning of the chapter, in chapter 2, man is in a bad spot. He is out of fellowship with God. And even though there has been messages of hope, or the idea of hope, contained in Genesis 3 and verse 15, where, as we said, the serpent would bruise the seed of woman, that is Christ. He would deal him a minor blow, and Christ, the seed of woman, would deal a death blow, a blow to the head, to Satan, a very major blow, a very major defeat. So you also have the note of hope that is found in Genesis chapter 9, or actually chapter 6 through 9, when Noah is chosen along with his family to build the ark and to survive the flood with the animals that they took on the ark at God's command. So chapter 9, even though it ends with sin on the part of Noah and Ham, the note of hope again is there, in that Noah and his sons and all their wives are still alive. So, as we said, it's through the line of Shem that God chose to bring forth a people that is special to himself. And the beginning of that line, as I say, it starts with Shem, but as you go down through the genealogies there, in the first chapters of Genesis, then you see that Abraham comes from the line of Shem. So this is where we begin in chapter 12, with God choosing Abraham and evidently there's already some sort of relationship between him and Abraham, because when Abraham is called to leave his homeland, he simply gets up and goes. And so we're not given the background of how long Abraham had been following God, or at this time his name is Abram in chapter 12. But the way back to God, the way to restore fellowship with God begins with Abraham. That is to say, Genesis 1 through 11 tells us about the perfect creation, perfect fellowship with God. That's chapters 1 and 2, and then chapter 3 through chapter 11 tells us about the breaking of fellowship with God. And then chapter 12, as we said, through up into the New Testament. Actually, I think we said that was always all the way to Revelation chapter 18 is God's plan to fix the problem and bring man back into fellowship with him. Again, I may be off on those numbers. I haven't looked at them in a little while. Let me go back and see what I can find here. Yeah, Genesis 12 through Revelation 18, with the climax to the resolution happening during the life, ministry, death, and resurrection of Christ. And then the closing and final fulfillment of all of it is found, is portrayed in Revelation chapters 19 through 22. So, this brings us to Abraham, and the title of this chapter is Covenant. God makes a promise and establishes a people. Now, they began the chapter with a discussion of marriage. Just a second. And the reason for doing so is to point out the idea of what a covenant is. The basic idea of it is that it's a it's a very important agreement in the case of marriage, and it is a binding agreement between one man and one woman, and in a very real sense, God is also involved in that covenant. So a covenant, an agreement, is extremely important. I mean, a covenant, a contract, you might say, although that doesn't sound like it's the same thing, because it's really not, because contract can be just business. But, the marriage contract, the marriage covenant is a whole lot more special than a simple business contract. But the basic idea is the same, in that it's an agreement between two parties which binds them together for a period of time. In the case of a business contract or a covenant or agreement, until the project is finished or whatever the case may be. But the marriage contract or covenant is for life. Okay? As the wedding vows state, the idea of we will be married as long as both of us shall live. So there is a binding nature to any contract of any kind. Well, sorry, I keep getting these messages and so forth, and I'm going to have to get away from those and concentrate a little bit better. But when it comes to the covenant that we're talking about in the context of the beginning of Genesis 12 and on throughout the Old Testament, specifically the covenant that is made with Abraham, and then the covenant that is made with the people of Israel, the descendants of Abraham, and then the new covenant that is made with the people who choose to become Christians. It's all, except for the details, it's all the same. And a lot of people, don't realize, or at least they don't appreciate the idea of the fact that we have a covenant with God, we have an agreement with God as Christians. If we are New Testament Christians, if we are faithful Christians, if we have obeyed the gospel, then we have an agreement with God, a covenant with God, and it's binding. Well, let's move on and think about covenants specifically, the idea of covenants. And as you will see in the PowerPoint slide, in the ancient world, a covenant was a legal binding agreement between two parties that brought them into a special relationship. Now, there were two types of treaties in the ancient Near East, and they are listed there on the first slide, or actually the second slide after the title slide, first one after the title slide. And that is that there was a treaty or a covenant known between friends. That is, a covenant that was made between friends, between equals. That is, this king is on a level with this king, and they make an agreement to do, this guy does one thing, does something for the other, and he does something back because of that agreement. As in the case of Solomon and Hiram, Hiram actually sent things to David in 1 Kings chapter, I'm sorry, it was 2 Samuel, I believe it was chapter 5. Let me go over here real quick and check something. Yeah, 2 Samuel chapter 5. Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. 2 Samuel 5:11. Well, then when Solomon becomes king in 1 Kings chapter 5, Hiram enters an agreement with Solomon there in 1 Kings chapter 5. And Hiram agrees to send him cedar and cypress timber. I think there was also some large stones, huge stones that were involved in that too. And then Solomon, in return, in 1 Kings 5:11, gave Hiram, as it puts it here in the New American Standard, 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of beaten oil. Thus, Solomon would give Hiram year by year. So the agreement is as long as you're sending me wood and stone, as well as carpenters and people who can help me to build my house and the temple of God, then I will send you these goods every year. So this is an agreement between equals. But then there's also what is called the Lord-Vassal Treaty. This is a covenant between unequals. That is, there's this greater king who is more powerful. He's got a greater army. He's got a greater nation. His nation is in power in the region or in that part of the world at the time. And he goes into another nation basically with the idea of taking them over and telling them, you better do what I say, and you better pay me this amount of taxes every year, and so forth. But in return, if you keep the covenant, I will protect you. That is, if you're invaded by another army, another nation, then I will send my troops to help defend against that invader. But if you don't obey me, if you don't do what I say, I will punish you with the eventual idea of either removing the king from power or killing the king or killing the people of the nation, a great many of the people, until they come back into line with what the ruling king said. So in this case, it's a covenant between a greater and a lesser, a greater king and a lesser king, a greater nation and a lesser nation. Now, in the case of the Mosaic covenant, it definitely was a Lord-Vassal treaty, because God says over and over, if you do what I say, I will bless you. If you don't do what I say, I will punish you. Okay? And the same goes for the new covenant too. You say, well, how in the world could a God of peace and grace and love make a Lord-Vassal treaty with us in this day and time? I mean, what it's all about grace and mercy and love, and God is a God of love. He's not the same God as he was in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, he was harsh, and he punished people right then and right there. But now, he doesn't do that. So therefore, he's a patient God. He's again, very nice. Well, the fact is that he is still the greater and we are still the lesser. And even in the New Testament, we are given some very negative statements concerning the the nature of the covenant that we are in. And let me just give you a few of those. If you go to John chapter 8, in John 8:24, Jesus said, "Therefore I said to you that you will die in your sins, for unless you believe that I am He, you will die in your sins." You know, back when, let me go back for just a minute, back when Moses was giving the law again in the book of Deuteronomy, this was to the nation, the people of the nation who had survived the wilderness wanderings, and none of the original generation that came out of Egypt is alive except for two people, and that is Joshua and Caleb. And Moses is still alive, but he's not going to enter the promised land because of his sin concerning the rock with the water. But one of the statements that Moses makes is that he says, "I lay before you today life and death." Okay? That is, they are going to agree to the covenant, the people that are standing there, because it was their parents who had agreed to the covenant at the time before. So it's this new generation that needs to agree to the covenant again, and or in their case for the first time. And he's just telling them, you know, and he has also talked about in the previous chapters before he said this, he has, you know, given the blessings that God would give if they obeyed, and he has given the curses that God would bring if they did not obey. And he basically sums all that up in that statement, "I lay before you today life and death." And they had to choose between life and death. If they chose to follow the covenant of God and be obedient to it and faithful to it, then there would be life. If they did not, then there would be death. And eventually that's what happened, was their punishment, which we will look at as we go through this course. Before we end, we will have covered the deportation, the captivity of Israel, or of Judah, and also the destruction of Israel, the northern kingdom. But, again, Moses puts it in those terms by the inspiration of God and says, here's life and here's death. You need to choose. Well, when you come to the New Testament, we've already seen here in John chapter 8 and verse 24, if you do not believe that I am He, that is, I am the Christ, literally, he says, if you do not believe that I am, which is a claim to deity, to being the Son of God, because he's taking on himself the name of God. If you go back to Exodus chapter 3, where Moses comes upon the burning bush, and He begins his conversation with God out of the burning bush. And God and Moses at one point asked the question, said, whom shall I say sent me? That is, God has told him to go back to Egypt and rescue, lead out the Egyptians, the Israelites from Egypt. And, basically Moses is saying, how am I going to convince them that you have sent me? So I need some evidence. I need something to convince them. And he said, so whom shall I say sent me? And he says, you tell them that I am has sent you. So the very name of God, the verb there for I am, whether it be in Hebrew or Greek, that is, it's in Hebrew when Moses, or at least it's recorded in Hebrew, when it's stated to Moses, but in Greek, it's the same idea that it's the infinitive. Okay, if you're up on your English grammar, you would know that the infinitive is simply the basic form of the infinitive is simply to be. Okay, but as you move out from the basic form, you can say to run, to walk, to live. So any verb that you want to come up with, to play, with the word to in front of it, it's the infinitive. But again, the basic form of the infinitive is simply to be. So God is claiming here with his name, giving his name, I am. He is claiming eternality, because he is simply saying, I am. Not I was, not I came into being, not I will go out of existence at some point in the future, but I am. I simply am. I exist. Okay? So it speaks to his eternality, and therefore it speaks to his deity, his being deity, and therefore, his being eternal. It's one of the attributes of deity. So, when Jesus says, unless you believe that I am, okay, so Jesus here is making a claim to deity. He is taking for himself the name of God that was given to Moses to give to the children of Israel. And he says, unless you believe that I'm deity, unless you believe that I simply exist, that I'm eternal, you'll die in your sins. Now, going back for a moment to the thing that Moses said to the Israelites, he said, I lay before you today life and death. You make a choice. And what does this sound like? Unless you believe that I am he, you will die in your sins. It sounds like life and death to me. And then you go to Luke 13, verses 3 and 5. Jesus said, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Sounds like life and death to me. And then in Matthew chapter 18, verses 32 and 33, where Jesus says, if you confess me before men, him will I also confess, or whoever confesses me before men, him will I also confess before the Father which is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, him will I also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Sounds like life and death to me. And then in Mark chapter 16, in verse 16, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believes not shall be condemned. Again, sounds like life and death to me. And then when you come to another example would be Galatians chapter 1, where you have in verses 6 through 9, Paul says, I am amazed that you're so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is really not another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to what we have preached to you, he is to be accursed. As we have said before, so I say again now, if any man is preaching to you a gospel contrary to what you received, he is to be accursed. Now, that word accursed is the Greek word anathema. Okay? It is the Greek word anathema. Now, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's bring it up in a Greek lexicon. And it has to do with, again, being cursed, being, it says, well, I was thinking that there would be more to it than that, but the idea is that, in this case, Paul is not. What I'm trying to bring out here is, and I was thinking I was going to find it in the definition, but evidently not. What I was trying to bring out is that when Paul says, whoever brings a different gospel than what we brought to you, let him be accursed, let him be anathema, let him be under the curse of God. Okay? And again, that just fits extremely well with what we spoke of in Deuteronomy, where God said, specifically in Deuteronomy 28, the first 14 verses, he gives all the blessings that will happen to them if they do what he says. And then he will, in the verses 15 and following, all the way through the end of the chapter, probably around 50 verses, it talks about the curses that would be brought upon those who did not obey God. So, those who don't obey God will be under a curse from God. Those who preach a different gospel will be under a curse. The implication is from God. So, this brings us back to the fact of the Lord-vassal treaty and the fact that God has that same type of treaty with us today. But the main point of our discussion is the treaty, the covenant, the agreement that God makes with Abraham. Now, in Galatians, trying to get to Genesis 12. In Genesis chapter 12, you have in chapter 11, prior to that, you have the genealogy of Shem at the very end of the chapter, or I say the very end, verses 10 through verse 32. Okay, and you see that from Shem being the first person there in verse 10, you have it all the way down to verse, let's say, let's start with verse 26. Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. That is, again, Abram's father. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. So throughout the rest of this account, anytime it talks about Abraham and Lot, Lot is the nephew of Abram or Abraham. Then it says in verse 28, Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Sarai was barren; she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went out together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Then, chapter 12, we have, at the beginning, God speaking with Abram and making this covenant with him. At least at this point, he gives him part of the covenant, because later in chapter 15 he will actually ratify the covenant, make it binding. So he says, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And some translations say, so you shall, he goes on, he says, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his nephew, and all their possessions which they had accumulated, and the persons which they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Thus they came to the land of Canaan. So, again, in the in the covenant that God makes with him, or at least the part of the covenant that he speaks of here, he makes a land promise. He also makes a promise of many descendants. He makes a promise of blessing, and then he makes a promise of blessings and curses on other people, depending on how they relate to Abram. Okay? Again, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. So, we have this agreement with Abraham, and then we come to, I want to point out here in the slideshow that you have a map on slide number 7, where you have the route of Abraham and his family. And as you remember, the text said that they left Ur of the Chaldeans and went up to Haran. Ur of the Chaldeans is down in the bottom right corner of the map, just above the Persian Gulf. And then the route goes up to Haran, which is in the north. And then the route goes down into Canaan. Now, eventually, Abraham will go down into Egypt and then come back into Canaan because of a famine. But this is the route that is taken by Abraham, or at least the most likely route. And Ur of the Chaldeans, the one identified there to the south, just above the Persian Gulf, is the most likely location of Ur of the Chaldeans. There's another Ur elsewhere to the north, but the most likely one has been identified as the one to the south. Well, then we come to chapter 15, where God ratifies his covenant, and he he says there in verse 1, he says, "Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you, and your reward shall be very great." And then there's a back and forth about who's going to be the heir of Abraham. And then God says, he offers Eliezer of Damascus, his steward, his chief steward, his right-hand man, you might say. But he's a slave in Abraham's house. And God says, "No, this man will not be your heir, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir." Verse 5, "And he took him outside and said, Now look toward the heavens and count the stars if you are unable to count them. And he said to him, So shall your descendants be. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness." And we'll come back to that in a minute. But then he said, and he in verse 7, he said to him, "I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it." He said, "O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it?" And then in verse 9 it says, "So he," that is God, "said to him, Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon." Then he brought all these to him, and cut them in two, and laid each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. The birds of prey came down upon the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, terror and great darkness fell upon him. God said to Abram, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I also will judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You will be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they will return here," that is, to the land of Canaan, "for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." Now, we need to talk about this particular event, specifically about the animals that are cut in half, and the birds that are laid opposite each other, because there are 2 birds and he didn't cut them in half, he just laid them opposite of each other. But the rest of the animals, the heifer, the female goat, the ram, all were cut in half and laid opposite. The 2 halves are laid opposite each other. And then, let's explain that first. What we need to understand is that when a covenant, one of these lord-vassal treaties, was made, the 2 parties, the 2 kings, or I assume their representatives, but it's still as binding. But let's just say it was the 2 kings that are making the agreement, the covenant. The 2 kings there would be these animals that would be cut in half, again, the halves laid opposite each other, and the 2 kings would pass either together or at different times between these animals. And basically what they're saying is that if I don't keep the covenant, if I don't keep this agreement, then the other party is free to make me like one of these animals. Okay? It's a very symbolic situation. That is to say, these animals have been killed and their carcass scattered, okay? Basically, separated from one half from the other. And, you're saying if you're making the agreement with the other one, if I do not keep what is stipulated in this agreement, then you, the other one, are free to do to me just what happened to these animals, to kill me. And again, that's both the Lord and the vassal. Okay? That is to say, the king that is the greater even makes that agreement. He says, if I don't keep my end of the agreement, then, let me be killed. Okay? But here's the difference between that type of treaty, that type of agreement, that type of ceremony, and the one that we see here with Abram and God. Notice in verse 17, which we didn't read at the time, it came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenite, the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite. Okay? But what's unique about this situation is in verse 17, Abram does not have to pass between the pieces of animals. It's only God in the form of a smoking oven and a flaming torch. This is the vision that Abraham saw. Okay, because if you remember back in verse 12, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and so he's asleep. So this is a vision, it's a dream that he has, but still it is God who is passing between the pieces. Abram is not expected to do so, and he doesn't. Not because he refused, but because God did not require him to do so. So the point is that God is the one who has made the agreement with Abraham, or with Abram. Again, his name has not yet been changed. God's the one who makes the agreement with Abraham, and God's the one who holds himself to the covenant by passing through the pieces of animals. And it's not that Abraham didn't have any responsibilities, or that Abraham wasn't bound to the covenant, but it's symbolic of the idea that God is the one who's making the covenant, and God is the one who, God is the one who is going through the process to agree to the covenant. So this is extremely important. Now, getting back to the textbook, let's see what else we need to mention. They have a side note here, there in the middle of the page on page 33, or at some point on the page on page 33. where it says, the Pentateuch and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, are often called the Pentateuch by Christians. But these same 5 books in the Hebrew Bible are referred to as the Torah by the Jews. Now, the word Torah or Torah in the Hebrew is simply the law. Okay, that's the Hebrew word for law. Now, Pentateuch, the name Pentateuch comes from the idea of there being 5 books. Penta, 5. Tuch is the idea of scroll or book. Okay, so 5 books. All right. Well, we've talked about Genesis 15. So, and they describe this fact that God is the one who is ratifying the covenant. He's the only one who passes through the pieces. And as they put it, that is, God seems to be unilaterally binding himself to this covenant. And Genesis 15:18 summarizes this event by saying, on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, to your descendants, I give this land. Now, I want to stop here for a second and cover this idea real quick. I mean, I don't want to, be jumping ahead like this too much, like I have in the early part of this video from the Old Testament to the New Testament. But a lot of people look at this promise concerning the land promise that God makes for Abraham, and they say that this promise has not yet been fulfilled. They say that the nation of Israel today is awaiting the return of Christ to come back to earth to reign for 1,000 years in Jerusalem on the throne of David. He's going to raise up an army, and he's going to drive out all the peoples that are not Jews, or at least are enemies of the Jews. Let's put it that way. Now, again, part of this is based on the idea that the land promise has not been fulfilled. But let's go to, and again, we're going to cover this more completely in the conquest and Canaanization chapter. But let's go to, I think it's Joshua. It's going to be one of the later chapters. Yeah, Joshua chapter 21. After God has, this is near the end of the book of Joshua, and God has divided the land between them. That is to say, they have in the first part of the book of Joshua, I forget what chapter it goes up to, but it starts somewhere around Joshua chapter 4 or 5. But in the early parts of the book of Joshua, up to about a little past the middle, you have the whole nation of Israel, or all the army, the whole army of Israel fighting together to drive out and defeat the nations that are in the land, the larger nations, the larger groups of people. And it takes, the whole army with the power of God, obviously, to defeat these people. Well, after that happens, the land is divided up between the 12 tribes, And the 12 tribes are expected to drive out the smaller groups of people that are within their own tribal territory. And that's an extremely important part that we're going to talk about when we get here in our study. But at the end of this division of the land, after these major armies have been defeated, you have the last part of Joshua chapter 21, starting in verse 43. It says this: So the Lord gave Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they possessed it and lived in it. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and no one of all their enemies stood before them. The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. So the land promise is fulfilled. Now, what does it mean that no one of all their enemies stood before them? The Lord gave all their enemies into their hand. I thought, I just said that there were still some people to drive out and so forth. The fact is that God told them, you go in, you drive out these inhabitants, and I will be with you in doing so. Okay? So even the people that are still in the land, the enemies that are still in the land, okay, are in effect defeated at this point. But it's when the tribes go out to their land, to their tribal land, that they lose their faith. They become doubtful again, like they did earlier in Numbers chapter 13. And they don't drive out the people that God had given into their hand. They just don't do it. So God kept his end of the bargain. God fulfilled all his promises concerning the land. And as you go through the end of Joshua and then into the beginning of Judges, this would be Judges chapter 1. Okay. It came about after the death of Joshua that the sons of Israel inquired of the Lord, saying, Who shall go up first for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? And the Lord said, Judah shall go up, because, behold, I have given the land into his hand. This would be the area of the tribe of Judah, because they're going up against Jerusalem. Okay? And then Judah said to Simeon, verse 3, and again, let's go back to verse 2, just to make this point again. I have given the land into his hand. All right? Then Judah said to Simeon, his brother, Come up with me into the territory allotted to me, that we may fight against the Canaanites, and I, in turn, will go with you into the territory allotted to you. So Simeon went with him. And then Judah went up, and the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they defeated 10,000 men of Bezek. They found Adoni-Bezek in Bezek and fought against him, and they defeated the Canaanites and the Perizzites. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and his big toes. Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes I cut off. Used to gather up scraps under my table. As I have done, so God has repaid me. Then the sons, verse 8, then the sons of Judah fought against Jerusalem and captured it and struck it with the edge of the sword and set the city on fire. Afterward, the sons of Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country and in the Negev, and in the lowland. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba, and they struck Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. Then from there he went against the inhabitants of Debir, and so forth. And you come on down again, you're still talking about Judah. And then in verse 17, then Judah went with Simeon his brother, and they struck the Canaanites living in Zephath and utterly destroyed it. So the name of the city was called Hormah. And then on down, again, still the people of Judah and the people of Simeon are fighting together. Then, verse 20, they gave Hebron to Caleb as Moses had promised, and he drove out from there the 3 sons of Anak. Verse 21, but the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. There is the beginning of the problem. The Benjamites do not drive out some of the people. God said, I will be with you, and I have given these people into your hand. But they didn't follow through. And now you've got the people of the land living with the Israelites. And God says, or he has said in places before, and he'll say again, and he said, okay, if you're not going to drive them out, then I'll leave them there. And now you won't be able to drive them out because I'm going to use them to punish you. So you keep going down, starting in verse 27, places not conquered. Manasseh did not take possession of Bethshan and its villages, or Ta'anak and its villages, or the inhabitants of Dor and its villages, or the inhabitants of Ibleam and its villages, or the inhabitants of Megiddo and its villages. So the Canaanites persisted in living in that land. It came about when Israel became strong that they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but they did not drive them out completely. And then Ephraim did not drive out people from his land. Zebulun did not drive out. Asher did not drive out. Naphtali did not drive out. Then in verse 34, the Amorites forced the sons of Dan into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the valley. Yet the Amorites persisted, living in Mount Heres, in Aijalon, and in Shaalbim. But when the power of the house of Joseph grew strong, they became forced labor. The border of the Amorites ran from the ascent of Akrabim, from Selah and upward. Okay? And here's the statement in Judges chapter 2 that I was speaking of earlier. One of the statements. Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named that place Bochim, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. Okay? So, just to reiterate, just to summarize, and we'll stop for this session. God had promised to Abraham in Genesis 15 and in Genesis 12, he had promised him the land of Canaan, from the river of Egypt all the way up to the river Euphrates. Okay? A huge amount of land. And he fulfilled that promise. He gave them the land. He defeated, with the whole nation of Israel, he defeated all the nations, the large nations that would have been too hard for them to defeat, or, well, it wouldn't have been too hard, because if God's on their side, they could do it with one man. But the point is that evidently God wanted all the people to be involved so that they didn't become fearful, okay? But then once they got the bigger nations out of the way, they were supposed to go into their own tribal lands and drive out the smaller nations, smaller groups of people. So God kept his end of the bargain. He gave them the land, and they did not follow through. So don't let anybody tell you that the land promise is still in effect, that it has not yet been fulfilled, and it will be fulfilled at a later date when Christ returns. It's just not true. Now, some people say, well, they were driven out of the land in the destruction of the northern kingdom and in the captivity into Babylon for Judah. And the idea there is that was already promised back in the law. If you rebuke me, if you disobey me, then I will send famine and locusts and disease and so forth. And if you don't listen to me after those punishments, I'll bring in invading armies. And if you don't listen to me after the armies invade you, then I will have those armies take you away from the land and go off into captivity, and you will lose the land. Okay? And that's exactly what happened. But because of his promises to David and to Abraham and so forth, and his plan to bring mankind back into fellowship with him, or at least those who wanted to be in fellowship with him, to bring them back, he had a remnant return from captivity to come back to Israel to rebuild, to continue the line of Abraham, so that the Christ could be brought into the world through the line of Abraham, specifically the line of Judah. Okay? So, again, it's not that, well, God took them out of the land and he's got to redo that promise or whatever. No. Once the promise is fulfilled, it's done. And there's nothing else to look for concerning the land of Israel. Okay? All right. We'll stop here and pick up with the next part of the covenant with Abraham in the next session. As always, call on me if you need any help. Have a great day.